An overemphasis on punitive approaches, a misplaced belief about deterrence, and the political ease of being tough on crime have led to some poor policy choices. I think that it's also contributed to a misunderstanding of the crime problem and created a climate of concern and sometimes a fear of crime in the community that's misplaced. In turn, these effects have generated a demand for harsher responses to crime and a more ready acceptance by the community of tougher sentencing policies. Law and order has become a political football. Being tough on crime, or being able to say you are, matters. And this has been true across a number of countries over the last 20 to 30 years, not just New Zealand. It has become important for politicians to be seen to be doing something about crime. It is particularly important around sentinel events, high-profile, horrendous offences, or apparent failures of the criminal justice system that get large-scale media attention. Policies and laws are developed to cope with extreme and often difficult cases, and they are always at risk of being poorly conceived and having unwanted and unintended consequences. The offending by Graham Burton that culminated in the killing of Carl Kuchenbecker was a sentinel event. It contributed to the adoption of New Zealand's version of the Three Strikes Law. Burton was likened to William Bell. You may recall Bell was the parolee who committed a number of horrible offences, including murder, at the Panmure RSA. The cases had very similar characteristics. Both men were violent offenders. Both committed murder while on parole. The key feature that was seized upon was their criminal histories, especially their serious violence histories. Both National and Act developed policies aimed at putting or keeping offenders like Burton and Bell in prison for longer. Repeat violent offenders, or the worst of the worst as they were termed, required new policies. Act got the ball rolling with its Three Strikes policy. A strike was initially defined as a sentence of 5 years or more for one or more of a specified range of serious violent and sexual offences. It was a logical place to start, and it applied two sensible restrictions. First, it was limited to a range of more serious offences, and secondly, the actual instance of the offending had to be at the more serious end. It had to be sufficient to attract a substantial sentence. The problem with it was that there were only a few offenders who actually met the definition. Politically, the numbers weren't large enough. The National Party had already committed itself to a larger increase in expenditure. National effectively took over the bill and looked to alter the definition so that a larger number of people would be caught by it. At that point, the policy started to go awry. I've had the opportunity through the Official Information Act to read many of the background documents, and it becomes it's clear very quickly that the government was simply fixated on the numbers. How many offenders would be affected, how many prison beds would be required, and how much would it cost. There was no interest in any information about the people who might be affected, what crimes had they actually committed, and whether there was any risk of an unjust outcome occurring. Risks of injustice always arise when fixed penalties are imposed without any regard to the particular facts of the offending. And in this instance, we ended up talking about a group of people who were simply convicted of an offence. It didn't matter how serious your particular instance of that offence was compared to anybody else's. If you had racked up the necessary 2 prior convictions, then you would be sentenced to exactly the same term. Our courts and criminal justice processes have evolved over centuries to avoid injustice. The normal process enables the sentence to be determined having regard to the seriousness of the offending and the circumstances of the offender. On a third strike, the law now effectively treats everyone the same. The nature of their prior offences are irrelevant. The facts of the current offence are irrelevant. Consider 2 rape offenders on a third strike. One is convicted of rape in circumstances where consensual sexual activity was taking place, it reached the point of intercourse, and then the complainant withdrew consent. The other offender abducts someone, commits rape, aggravated by degrading acts, and facilitated by violence. both people will receive the same sentence. Possibly worse, on a third strike, the less serious offender will spend 20 years in prison, but someone convicted of something along the lines of the other offence I described would be sentenced to 9 to 14 years, depending on their past and their plea, and they might serve as little as 6 years. In my view, this approach to sentencing is wrong as a matter of principle. If the same penalty is imposed for very different offending, there is no justice. If there are markedly shorter sentences for much more serious offences, there is no justice. The government disagrees. They say these offenders are sufficiently alike. They are, because they are the worst of the worst. The data that the government used to forecast prison beds and costs can also be used to gain some sense of how alike the offenders might really be. The data included information on the sentences imposed on offenders who were being sentenced for the equivalent of a third strike. So an aggravated robber who had a previous robbery and an injuring with intent to injure, for instance. I used that data to draw some graphs. The graphs I'm going to show you just cover two offences, rape and aggravated robbery, but the patterns that you see in these graphs are repeated across any of the strike offences. There are four offenders sentenced on a third strike equivalent between 2000 and 2009. The graphs show an estimate of the time the offenders would likely have served under the old regime and the time they have to serve under three strikes. The first graph deals with rape. Each column on that graph represents an offender. The black portion is an estimate of the time the offenders would have served under the original sentence. The estimates are simply based on the average proportion served by serious violent and sexual offenders. The black lines to the right, that run right to the maximum sentence, represent individuals who have been sentenced to preventive detention. Preventive detention is an indeterminate sentence. Offenders are only released when they're considered to no longer be a risk to the community. Some of them may never be released. There's a guy down in Christchurch at the moment who's been there for 47 years. The change in time served, it says here, is represented by the blue lines. I have no idea what colour you're getting to see. It's not blue. Because those offenders will now simply have to serve 20 years, which is the maximum penalty for rape. All of the 47 offenders who were sentenced on third strike equivalent, were imprisoned. As you can see, judges found there to be substantial variation reflecting differences in the circumstances of the offending and the offender. The use of preventive detention for 12 of the offenders shows that the courts are adept at distinguishing the worst of the worst. Under three strikes, more than half of the offenders will have their time spent in prison trebled or more. The differences in their offending and the circumstances of the offender are simply washed away. The next graph just addresses aggravated robbery. The maximum penalty for aggravated robbery is 14 years. All the third strike equivalent offenders were imprisoned. There were 89 across the 10 years. Again, you can see that the judges found substantial variation between the offenders. An aggravated robbery is not necessarily a big offence. If after I leave here tonight, a couple of you come up and demand my computer, you've just committed an aggravated robbery. If you've got a couple of other offences, and I saw that plenty of you were paying up for your fines before, you could be in difficult territory. Under the three strikes regime, more than 3/4 of these people would have their time spent in prison trebled or more. For both offences, it's readily apparent that three strikes sweeps away the differences in the actual offender. The courts drew major distinctions between the cases. They were able to recognise differences in the true seriousness of the offending. These cases are not alike, and they cannot be treated as if they're the same. What we are doing is treating a large number of offenders as if they are Graham Burton or William Bell. We're sentencing them on suspicion. The coercive power of the state is being used to deprive some of its members of their liberty. From where I stand, that's just simply philosophically wrong. It's wrong to apply a broad brush in that fashion. It isn't okay to lock away 50 or 100 people to try and prevent the offending of one or two of them. It would be great to be able to prevent all of the horrific offences, but it's not reasonable to do it by robbing a much larger group of 5 to 15 years of their lives and changing their futures. I agree that there are some who should be locked away, but I would argue that preventive detention provides for that to happen. Preventive detention comes with some protections. Preventive detention requires an individual assessment of the offender and a look at their circumstances. And in fact, there are much better ways of stopping both Burton and Bell. Better parole decision making, changes have been put in place. Better parole administration, again changes have been put in place. And a more alert and responsive police would almost have certainly prevented both of them from committing the offences they did. If misconceptions about crime and logical but mistaken beliefs about deterrence and incapacitation have led us up a blind alley and drawn us to policies that are flawed, then where do we turn? If being more punitive fails, are there other choices we can turn to? Now we can get to that slide. Many people do think that there are other alternatives, but they also all know that there are no easy options. Some of the options focus on removing or minimising the barriers that reduce the chances of current offenders becoming law-abiding, productive participants in the community. There is the challenge of the effects of drug and alcohol abuse. Many numbers are thrown around about the contribution this has on crime. According to corrections, 70% of offenders apprehended by the police in 2007 were under the influence of drug or alcohol. And 2/3 of prisoners in 2008 had an ongoing alcohol or drug problem. The government in the last budget has begun responding to this. But on its own, it will only make a marginal difference. Many prisoners have untreated mental and physical health problems. Currently, the health needs of prisoners are met by a special service within corrections. Many commentators have suggested that this should change, with responsibility moving to the health system. They expect that this would result in a marked change to prisoner health. But even if offenders were to become drug-free, off the booze and healthy, many will still need a huge amount of help to be able to fit into the community. They need to be capable of being employed, they need jobs, they need housing, and they need to be able to connect with family and with the community at large. Literacy, numeracy, work and social skills are lacking. More programs are required. Making these things happen isn't easy, and it isn't cheap, and there will be failures, spectacular ones. And it's politically challenging because of the perception that offenders are being rewarded by having special attention paid to them. But conversely, if we don't look at these things, if we don't make changes, we'll continue to bear the social and fiscal costs of crime. We need to be having a real informed discussion around the possibilities. Personally, I would abolish unjust policies like 3 strikes, and I'd put the money allocated to it into rehabilitation. Thank you.